Welcome to Human Monsters. September 24th, 1973, Casper, Wyoming. Amy Burridge was remembered as a tomboy who preferred the company of boys to girls and would rather have played baseball than with Barbie dolls. The evening of September 23rd, she was hanging out with her friend Danny when her sister Becky emerged from inside their home. Becky said, "Mom wants me to get some stuff at the store. Why don't you come along?" Amy said to Danny, "You want to go? We can get some candy." Danny asked his mother for permission, but she wouldn't allow it, given that it was 9 p.m. He was disappointed, but there was nothing he could do. Amy and Becky drove away. Jerry Jenkins was an intermittently employed father of two children. Both children were born to his girlfriend, Darcy. She was underage when Jerry impregnated her. He fled the state when his paternity came to light. Eventually, he would marry Darcy in secret. They would live together, with Darcy as the breadwinner most of the time. Jerry hated work, what with having to obey his superiors and the expectation that he actually show up, an expectation that was not always honored. At this point, he was 29 years old and still could not be relied upon to provide for his family. His latest job consisted of working at a gas station. He often no-showed, and Darcy couldn't take it anymore. She resolved to move to Colorado, where her parents had relocated. On September 23rd, he spent most of the evening with his friend, Ron Kennedy, drinking. After hours of downing beers, they pulled up at a convenience store that was located in front of a supermarket. Almost simultaneously, a white station wagon pulled up. An attractive young woman got out, flanked by a little girl with pigtails. Kennedy said, "Oh, baby, look at that. I'd like to meet her." Jenkins said, "Why don't you just go up and talk to her?" Jenkins was more fixated on scoring cigarettes and donuts than in hooking up with girls. Kennedy said, "Nah, I've got a better idea. Switch me places." At about 9 p.m., Amy placed a phone call from the convenience store's payphone to her family's home. She said to her mother, "We had a flat, and two nice men are going to give us a ride home." Her mother, Tony Case, said, "Okay, be careful and hurry. I'll wait up." The girls were only expected to be out for a half hour due to the close proximity of their house to the store. The phone call set Tony's mind at ease. For hours, the two men drove Amy and Becky around. It had been an abduction. The girls were forced by the men to lay on the seats so as to be invisible to onlookers. The most aggressive and pugnacious of the men, who identified as Kenny, beat the girls as the car was driven without an apparent destination in mind for the entire time the girls were kept in the car. They were frequently beaten and threatened. When the girls asked what was going to happen to them, inquiring specifically about whether or not they would be killed, the men just laughed at them. The men told them they were on their way to meet up with a man who would decide what to do with them. The car stopped in the middle of a bridge. Kenny got out of the passenger side door and pushed it forward. He reached for Amy. He said, You first. You can't go in together. The girls, in unison, begged the man to take them together. Becky said, "Oh, please, let me go in first and talk to these men." Kenny said, "No, I want the little one first." Considerable time elapsed, and the girls still hadn't returned home. Tony wondered if the men didn't come through for the girls after all. Tony got dressed and set out in the car to find the girls, assuming they might have been homeward bound on foot by then. When Tony pulled into the store's parking lot, she saw Becky's car, but neither of the girls were inside. She unlocked a door and found that there were no signs of the groceries they went there to buy. Tony drove throughout the township's streets looking for the girls, but there was no trace of them. She spent 2 hours searching, her anxiety at an apex. She gave up her own search at midnight. She called the police. The dispatcher took down the relevant information and issued a bolo to 3 cruisers so that they would search the area for the 2 girls. Tony asked a friend to spend the night so that she could have some support at a time when she had never felt more alone in her life. September 25th, 1973. Becky Burridge was at death's door. Only she was ushered to that door from a bridge. She was thrown at night into a river and hit some rocks so hard that her legs were rendered unresponsive, or at least they didn't respond to her impulse to move. She had never broken a bone before. Now they were protruding from her hips and useless to her. Though it was only late September, the water was freezing. The pain in her legs was excruciating and unendurable, especially when she tried to move them. When she hit the water, she nearly drowned. As she was submerged, her senses were temporarily disabled. She was nearly blinded by a beating she received by the man who threw her from the bridge, and now she couldn't even breathe. Determined to break free from the grip of death that continued to pull her downwards, she pulled her way to the surface as if literally pulling life back into her body. Considering how useless her legs had become, it was an almost impossible feat. Becky was thrown to where she was. Her assailants refused to let her put her undergarments on. She was permitted to put her sweater and jeans back on. The jeans slipped off as she burst through the surface. Becky swam to some large rocks that lined the shore of the river. It was a difficult swim, considering that she was propelled only by her arms. She was beaten black, blue, and bloody, benumbed by freezing cold water, and half naked from the waist down. But against all odds, she survived. She was in shock. Her body was functional. It was running on what a science fiction narrative might refer to as auxiliary power. All her major organs were working, and her nervous system did not shortchange her on the agonizing pain one would experience in that scenario. Everything that led to her climbing up on those stones was traumatic. Indeed, people become alcoholics, drug addicts, and suicidal depressives because of what Becky Burridge had gone through. People often throw the word horrific around lightly, as if an awkward social interaction could qualify as such. What Becky Burridge experienced that night was truly horrific. A complete detail by detail reenactment of what led to her being thrown over that bridge would never air on network television, for it would be deemed too disturbing and indecent for a mass audience. Becky's physical body was weakened, but her spirit was indomitable and still determined to overcome what had just been done to her. As she dragged her half immobile body beyond the stones, her bare skin was scraped and cut, making the journey painful in its own right. She wanted to find some soft grass on which she could recline. She reached some river brush root and sought solace within it. She balled herself into the fetal position. She covered her legs with her hair and used some uprooted bushes as cover. She kept urging herself not to fall asleep, fearing that to do so would ensure that she would die very soon. Becky heard a couple of male voices from above her. They were talking and laughing. She was pretty sure they were the men that put her there, though she could not verify this visually, not just because of the country dark, but she was blinded to such a degree that she would not have been able to see them from afar. She hoped that she would not be visible to them in the dark, and furthermore wished she had the ability to render herself invisible. Analgesic shock wore off, and Becky now experienced the full range of extreme pain that awaited her when she achieved neurological clarity. It was unbearable before, but now it was exotic in its unfamiliarity. After hours of torture by the perpetrators, the torture lived on, and now it emerged from within. The occasional car would drive across the bridge. Becky's sight was functional enough to see the beams of the headlights. Whether it was the assailants coming to check on her or motorists blithely unaware that a girl was tortured and left for dead within feet of them, she had no way of knowing. She figured that if there was any hope for a good Samaritan to discover her and alert EMTs, it would be after dawn. Daylight would be her only salvation. Becky was haunted by the crime that was perpetrated against her and her 11-year-old sister Amy hours later. She had no way of knowing where Amy was or if she was living or dead. Carl and Dorothy Strasser got up early that morning to go fishing. As they drove over a bridge, they spotted a small, red colored object, and it was animate. The red was a garment, and it was attached to a young girl. She was laying in the dirt at the end of the bridge. She was waving at them. Her red pullover was dirty, and she was naked from the waist down. There were no two ways about it. This girl was in trouble. Carl stopped his car and jumped out immediately so he could rush to the girl's aid. It couldn't have been more obvious that something truly egregious had happened to the girl. She was pale, and where she wasn't white in complexion, she was covered in dirt and blood. She was shivering from the cold, listless, and blood encrusted. Whatever happened to her, it was likely the kind of thing most people would live through. He could see the scars indicating where she had dragged herself to the roadside. Her left eye was swollen shut. That side of her head was black and purple. It was swollen. There was dried blood all over her face. There was a wound on her left hip so deep that fat was visible. The lower part of her body was flayed all over. Carl's wife Dorothy rushed over with a blanket she kept in the trunk. Carl said to the girl, "My God, what happened to you?" Though many victims of the type of crime that was visited upon Becky need more than a few hours to discuss it, she was strong enough to fill the Strassers in. "I was raped and thrown off the bridge, and my little sister, too. She's down there someplace, and I think she's dead. And I'm sorry for." Becky covered her midsection, feeling she owed some contrition to the Strassers, even though it was not her fault that she was half naked. Carl removed his jacket and tied the arms around her waist so that she could have her modesty. He asked her if she could walk. She said she couldn't. Together, the Strassers carried Becky to their car. Once she was inside, they cranked up the heat as far as it would go. Once inside, Carl said, "Are you sure your little sister is down there someplace?" Becky affirmed her belief that Amy was still down there. Carl walked over to the railing of the bridge and stretched out as far as he could to see if he could spot Amy. He didn't see anything. He was also anxious to bring Becky in for medical attention and felt the cursory search for Amy was only putting Becky at risk of further injury. During their commute, Becky asked if they had any water. They always took coffee on their fishing excursions, so they passed her the thermos. She gave them more details about her experience, which included being raped, beaten, and thrown from the bridge, which happened to both her and her sister. She called out to Amy while she was still on the rocks, but did not receive any responses. "Selfless as always," Becky said. "I'm not worried about me anymore, just Amy and my poor mother." Dorothy was a mother herself, and she did what she could to comfort Becky, including stroking her hair. They pulled up at Sloane's store, which was a popular spot for fishermen in the area. Carl ran inside and used the store's phone to call the sheriff's office. 20 minutes later, an ambulance arrived led by Sheriff Bill Estes. Estes spoke with Becky Thompson. He asked her if she was one of the two girls who were reported missing the evening before. While paramedics prepared her for the commute into town, she told her story. She suddenly became angry. She wanted to avenge the murder and attempted murder the perpetrators committed, not to mention the assaults and rapes. The following is an offense report that was written and filed shortly after this crime was reported. Narrative. Sometime after 9 p.m., September 24th, 1973, Becky Thompson and her sister Amy left their home at 2150 Glendale. Becky was driving her Ford station wagon. The two girls went to the Thriftway store located at 12th and Melrose. The girls went into the store, and when they returned to the Ford, they found the right rear tire flat. Then they called home and advised their mother that they would use some of the grocery money to have the tire repaired. When they went back to the Ford, they were offered help by the two above suspects. The suspects started to make motions of jacking the car up. Then one suspect produced a knife and advised the girls to get into their car. They were then driven to the Casper Mountain Road. The suspects then drove the girls to the area of Fremont Canyon near Pathfinder. At the point where the bridge crosses Fremont Canyon, the suspects stopped the car. One of the suspects then took Amy out of the car, and Becky was held on the floor of the back seat. The suspect then returned to the car without Amy. Becky was then taken out of the car and raped by each suspect. After being raped, Becky was then taken onto the bridge and thrown over the side. Around 10 a.m., Becky was brought into the hospital. She was examined by doctors as Tony held her hand. Aside from the previously mentioned injuries, diagnostic testing revealed her pelvis had been broken in 5 places. Remarkably, Becky never cried, not until Amy's name was mentioned. She managed to hold it together while she was questioned by detectives. She told them about how everything went down. Her car caught a flat, which infuriated her, as she had had it repaired just 2 days before. Cursing her luck, her frustration was apparent to two men who were sitting in a car nearby. The driver said, "Do you need any help?" She indicated that he was overweight with greasy, unkempt hair. She vaguely remembered that his name was Jerry, though she wasn't 100% on that. Becky said, "Well, yeah, sure." He said, "Do you have a spare tire?" "Well, yes, but it's also flat." "We'll help you anyway." Jerry and his lanky, wild eyed friend, Kenny, searched the trunk of their car for a jack. They lifted her car a few inches with the jack and then stopped. She also recalled the so called Kenny being addressed as Ronnie. Police knew who Becky was talking about as she described Jerry. In fact, both he and Ronald Leroy Kennedy were notorious within the local law enforcement circles. They were mostly known for committing petty crimes. They had been a nettlesome presence for local police for many years. Becky remembered one of them saying to her, "We're going to go to another station and see if they can fix your tire real fast." She said, "That'd be really great." "Okay, we'll leave our jack with you. You just sit here and make sure it doesn't get stolen or anything." "Okay, that's fine." Becky told Amy to call their mother to explain why they were delayed. About 5 minutes later, the two men returned. Only one thing they knew for sure was that they wanted Becky to go with them to the service station. Becky said, "Just a minute, I've got to go get my little sister." Amy was taking her time. She bought some candy first. Becky urged her to get on the phone. Suddenly, Becky felt something sharp and solid against her ribs. She looked down and saw that it was a blade. Kenny was holding a knife to her. He said, "Get in the car." Becky looked around for good Samaritans, but there were none to be found. Amid the flurry of activity that surrounded Becky as she received treatment from doctors and nurses, she was plagued by survivor's guilt. She said to Tony, "Mama, I don't think Amy's coming back. I knew I had to make it so I could tell you what happened." As Tony comforted Becky, a doctor removed a contact lens from Becky's swollen eye. That contact would prove to be indispensable for the police investigation. Police took a pile of photographs to Becky's bedside. Among the mugshots were Jerry Jenkins and Ron Leroy Kennedy. She picked both out without hesitation. Anybody who has experienced trauma at the hands of another person will tell you that you don't forget people who put you through trauma. You just don't. They tattoo a self portrait to your soul. Jerry Jenkins had served multiple prison sentences. He was nearly sent away for his participation in a gang rape, but the victim was unable to face him so she could testify against him in court, so she dropped the charges. Ron Kennedy was suspected of having committed a robbery and murder, but there was insufficient evidence to convict him. Like Jenkins, he too had been in and out of jail. They were both recidivist criminals and, therefore, kindred spirits. Ron was driving merrily along when Detective David Dovala spotted him and followed him to a traffic light. After Kennedy stopped at a red light, Dovala appeared at his window and pointed his gun at him. He dragged Kennedy out of his car and planted him on asphalt. He placed him under arrest. Reflecting on this incident years later, Dovala said, "If I could have seen years ahead, I probably would have shot him." A rescue diver was sent by police to the bridge at whence the girls were assaulted and thrown. So far, new items were entered into evidence. A pair of black panties were found on a road nearby, and two bright pink hair bows were found floating in the water. The first unmistakable indication of Amy's presence underwater came in the form of one of her sneakers. Assuming she couldn't be far from that site, the diver spotted her body floating near the bottom nearby. Her body was pointed face first against the bottom. Unlike Becky, when she was found, Amy was wearing a t-shirt and jeans. The diver touched her and found that not only had rigor mortis rendered her stiff, but the icy cold water of the river further contributed to the rigidity. He tied a nylon rope around her torso and tugged at it. He swam to the surface and used it to signal the law enforcement and medical professionals gathered on the bridge that he had found Amy. Deputies waded into the water to take hold of her. When the diver was asked if he saw anything else underwater, he said he saw one of her shoes. They told him to retrieve it. Amy's face was covered with blood that poured from her nose and mouth. X-rays performed on Amy later that day revealed that the left side of her rib cage had been crushed. Her spine had been driven into her brain. At the police station, Kennedy was questioned by detectives. After having his rights read to him, he said, "What's the charge?" One officer said, "Murder, rape, assault, and kidnapping." "How are you going to prove it? You've got no witnesses." One of the officers stood right in front of Kennedy and looked him square in the eye. He said, "Well, we have a surprise for you, Mr. Son of a Bitch. One of them is still alive." As Jerry Jenkins pulled up at a liquor store, one he broke into years ago with Ron Kennedy, two police officers pulled up and informed him he was under arrest. Jenkins was baffled. He said, "What's going on?" They told him he was suspected of committing a rape and murder. They read him his Miranda rights and placed him in handcuffs. When he was searched, an officer found the pocket knife Jenkins used to threaten Becky Burridge. Oh, and irony of ironies. Years before, Amy's grandmother, Alice Burridge, was a judge and presided over one of Jenkins's trials. She was sick of seeing his face. Making her own pronouncement on his grim future prospects, she said, "I guess you're just going to have to kill somebody before we put you away for good." Jenkins was questioned by detectives at the police station after he was read his Miranda rights. The first question, Did Ronnie let the air out of the tire? I didn't do it. I didn't let the air out of the tire. Did Ronnie let the air out of the tire? I didn't do it. We pulled up to the store and saw them come in the store behind there, the convenience store. Yeah, Ronnie said he wanted to meet her, so I told him to just go up and talk to her if he wanted to meet her, but he said no, he had a better way. He explained that he pulled in behind Becky's car and Kennedy got out. Jenkins said he was unable to see what happened next, but his guess was that Kennedy slashed her tire, for it flattened rapidly. Jenkins and Kennedy hid in the shadowed area of the parking lot and waited for the girls to exit the store. Then what happened? They came out and we was going to help them fix the flat. Only my wrench didn't work with her nuts. The jack was up under the car and the car was jacked up and my wrench didn't fit. I put the jack back in the car. After being pressed for more information, he said, well, the little one went and called her mother and said she had a flat tire. We said we would give them a ride home, and everything started happening. What do you mean, everything started happening? Ronnie became out of his gourd. Did Ronnie have the knife? Yeah, it was in the glove box. He knew it was there because I always kept it there. We started driving up the street, and then just boom. Just boom. Yeah, just boom. Everything went boom. Did Ronnie ever tell you the reason why he started hiding them in the car while you were still not very far from the grocery store? Jenkins shrugged and looked down at his hands. He said, no, he didn't. But being with Ronnie a few years, I think back in his own mind, I think he hated girls. I think that's because he had no reason, really, as far as I know. He didn't know them, and they didn't say nothing to upset him. Had you discussed this before the time you picked them up? No. They drove toward the Casper Mountains. Kennedy smacked the girls around as they drove. Jenkins was more concerned about the derelict car than he was about the plight of the girls. He said, I figured we'd just drive around and maybe calm them down and talk to the girls and try to scare them real good. And if they were scared, maybe they would shut up. Did they happen to tell you what their names were? I think they told me, but I can't remember. We'd been drinking since 4 o'clock and were pretty well wasted. Ronnie told them to lay down. So they laid down on the seat, and they stayed down until we got out of town. And the oldest one asked me if she could get up, and I said yes. But that's when Ronnie said, no, just stay there. So instead of getting him all riled, I just kept my mouth shut. Are you physically afraid of Ron Kennedy? No, it's not that. I just figured that if I got him riled up again, then he might start in on the girls again. I figured that if I just kept quiet and talked to him, that things would work out. He said that Kennedy didn't tell him what he intended to do to the girls. He said, I started driving out towards Alcova and just kept going. And then we got there, and Ronnie said he would talk to them one at a time. He said that at that time, Kennedy was only terrorizing the girls, as Jenkins put it. We was sitting there giving them the line. What kind of line? We were telling them a buddy of ours got hurt, and they were the ones that did it, and they were going to have to pay, and all this, and it was their fault, and we wanted to talk to them, and all this. Ronnie told the little one that he wanted to talk to her first. Did he just tell her to get out of the car? Yeah. We was there about 5 minutes at the most, and Ronnie opened the door and told the little girl to come on. What was the little girl's response to this? Was she afraid? I think she was a little afraid, but her older sister told her everything would be all right, and I told her not to worry. Nothing was going to happen. Could you see him after they left the car? No, it was dark as midnight out there. During the time the younger girl was out of the car with Ronnie, didn't you hear her call for help? No, I was talking to the other one in the car. Anyway, he came back, and the girl didn't come back with him. I asked him about it, and he said, she's over there thinking. And then he told me that we didn't have to worry about the talking. What did you figure he meant? I just figured what he meant. What did you figure happened to her? Jenkins had nothing for this. The detective said, where were you at the time? On the bridge? No, right on that little road. The road to the right or the road to the left? To the right. Do you know where the rape took place? That was on the left side of the road. Did both you and Ron Kennedy have intercourse with the girl? I'd rather not answer that. All right. Did Ron? I'd still rather not answer that. Did Ronnie then take the other girl out of the car, or did you both take her out? He got her out and started towards the car, or did you both take her out? He got her out and started walking towards the bridge. I got out of the car and followed them, and we just pushed her over. It was just like a sack of potatoes. Okay, now, were you aware of what was going to happen to the other girl when he started walking her towards the bridge? Did you have an idea what he was going to do? Jenkins just shrugged. I think in the back of my mind, but I don't think I wanted to accept it. My mind at the time was fighting with itself. I didn't know what to do, which way to go. What I wanted to do when we first left there was turn onto the bridge and on back to Casper. But then I pulled a few years in the joint and I was scared of going back. It's not that I feared the joint, I just don't want to pull no more time. So then basically, you didn't know when he was walking the 18-year-old onto the bridge that he had, in fact, thrown the little girl off? No. The only thing was, I couldn't figure out where she was, and I just figured maybe he had her down there and he might have done something to her. I didn't know until they told me what had happened when they picked me up. Now, on your conversation when you were coming back to Casper, did he tell you what he had done to the little girl? No. The only thing was, I asked Ronnie, I says, well, what are we going to do? And he said, just keep our mouths shut. And I told him I don't think I could do it, and that was the only thing that was said about it, because I had my own thoughts. I was thinking what I was going to do, and if I could live with it or not. And I didn't want to talk to him because I figured he might just tell me something that would get me upset, and then there'd be more. I just figured I'd do my own thinking and more than likely turn myself in. As Jenkins told it, they drove to another bridge and threw more evidence of the crime, i.e., Becky's purse and other belongings, into the water. He claimed that he went out to breakfast with Kennedy and that he told him he felt guilty about what they did to the girls. Kennedy did not share this feeling, only emphasizing that he would never be released from prison if he was convicted for what they had done. A very astute observation. Jenkins asked the officers if they would extend his apology to Becky. One of them promised to do so. Bonds for both Jenkins and Kennedy were set at $275,000 each. Tony was brought to the morgue to identify Amy's remains. When the sheet was pulled back, she said, "Yes, that's my baby." One night, Becky woke screaming. When a nurse came to her room, Becky was in a panic, telling her that the assailants would surely return to do her in. The nurse assured her that an armed police officer was stationed outside her room 24/7. When he came into her room, he vowed that he would rather die before he would let anybody hurt her again. Becky eventually grew placid, but for the rest of her life, she would never feel completely safe. The judge for the upcoming trial determined that it would be impossible to gather an impartial jury in Casper, as the entire community was outraged by what Jenkins and Kennedy had done. Some had even uttered death threats. Somebody lit a fire outside Jenkins' wife's apartment door. Police had to guard the homes of both men's relatives. The trial was moved to the neighboring community of Cheyenne. April 24th, 1974. The trial to establish the innocence or culpability of Ronald Leroy Kennedy and Jerry Jenkins had begun. Prosecutor Jack Burke said this as part of his opening statement. "Becky is alive. She's given her thanks to God for that. I really don't think she wants your sympathy. I think she wants your attention, your understanding for the story she has to tell, for the sake of Amy. I think she would appreciate your attention to each bit of evidence, its color, its shape, and where it fits into this picture." Becky was the first to testify as a witness. She indicated the presence of Ron Kennedy for the record by pointing at him. From there, she recounted how the crime transpired step by step. Part of the narrative was that she tried to save herself and Amy by unlocking the passenger's door. She stuck her leg out, hoping that another motorist would see it and put two and two together, concluding that an assault was taking place. This did not transpire, and Jenkins demanded that Kennedy close the door, which he did. Both she and Amy are crying, but of course, this did not elicit any sympathy from Jenkins and Kennedy. She revealed that Kennedy brandished his knife and stabbed the seat around Becky, having already tried to stab her in the chest. He positioned it close to her heart. He said to her, "Put your hand on the blade. Put your hand around the blade and feel this." Amy began to scream. She said, "Oh, please don't make her do that." Jenkins asked Kennedy for directions to their destination. Kennedy took a break from terrorizing the girls long enough to direct him. Amy tried to hold Becky's hand, but Kennedy wouldn't allow it. Amy said, "Becky, I love you so much." Kennedy pushed her hand away from Becky. Amy said, "Sir, can I ask you one question? Are you going to murder us?" Kennedy said, "What? Oh, no, honey. You've been watching too many detective stories on TV." Jenkins turned toward the Pathfinder Reservoir, whose road leads to the Fremont Canyon Bridge. Kennedy and Jenkins whispered to each other in conspiratorial tones. Amy and Becky managed to grab each other's hands, but Kennedy pushed Amy back in her seat and slapped both of their hands. Amy whispered to Becky, "Becky, if we ever get through this, I'll never be greedy again." Becky got choked up. It was a testament to Amy's innocence that her hunger for candy and the pleasure it provided was the sin that put them in danger. Becky said, "Amy, it's not your fault at all." Finally, the car came to a stop at one end of the bridge. Kennedy said, "Okay, here we are. You can't go in at the same time." The girls pleaded with him to let them go together. He refused their request. Alluding to some men that Jenkins and Kennedy had referred to earlier, Becky said, "Oh, please let me go in first and talk to these men." Kennedy said, "No, I want the little one first." Kennedy got out of the car. He offered Becky a beer. The beer was open, and he had been drinking from it. She took a few sips. Amy got out of the car at Kennedy's behest. Amy stopped crying and summoned as much stoicism as she could. She said to Becky, "Okay, Becky, I love you." Such were the last words Becky would ever hear from Amy. After Kennedy returned without Amy in tow, Jenkins started the car. He and Kennedy had a whispered conversation again. Becky said to them, "Please don't whisper. Please tell me what you're saying. Please don't whisper." They didn't respond. The assistant prosecutor said, "And what happens next, Becky?" "We went about 150 yards to 200 yards up the road, and then we stopped. And then they both raped me." Kennedy climbed into the back seat and disrobed. He removed Becky's clothes. She tried to push him away, trying to deflect all his attempts to touch her. He said to her, "Either you give in or you fight it." He unbuttoned her jeans with force and yanked them down. He tore her pullover off. He ripped off her undergarments and got on top of her. Becky said, "I've never had intercourse with anyone before." He said, "Oh, you've never been had before." He forced his way into her vagina and humped. He said, "Does this hurt?" She said, "Yes." He conveyed that he was glad it was painful for her. He pushed harder. The one silver lining was that he was short on endurance and ejaculated inside of her in less than a minute. He got out and returned to the passenger seat, where he put his clothes back on. Jenkins got out of the car and undressed. He got into the back seat. He said to Becky, "Touch me." She was confused by this instruction. Clarifying, he says, "My dick. Touch it." Kennedy was impatient for Jenkins to get it over with. He said, "Hurry, hurry. I think I see our signal." Jenkins violated Becky and ejaculated inside of her. He immediately got out of the car afterwards and put his clothes back on. Becky asked if she could put her clothes back on. Kennedy said, "Yes, everything but underwear." As she put her sweater and jeans back on, she said, "Thank you so much. Thank you so much for not letting my little sister see this." Kennedy said, "Oh, that's okay. She's too young." "I'm cold and the seat's wet back here." Kennedy said, "Did you wet your pants, baby?" Jenkins drove them to a spot where they said that a disabled man lived. In reality, it was just a public outhouse. Jenkins shut the car off, and both he and Kennedy got out. Kennedy said, "We both get to take you this time. We're going to meet your sister on the bridge." Once on the bridge, the men brought Becky to the railing. All she could see below was the opacity of night. Becky said, "It's dark out here. There's a canyon down there." Kennedy said, Oh no, that's just a bunch of trees. With a bridge over it? Kennedy stonewalled her. Having traversed 30 paces from the car, Kennedy began to speak again. Okay, we're going to meet Amy here. Upon the word here, as if on a premeditated cue, the men lifted Becky and pushed her up on top of the guardrail. She resisted, holding on to the rail. She utilized all the strength within her to resist their efforts to drop her. To distract her from this effort, Jenkins began to choke her. He started shouting, saying, "Make sure she's going to die. Make sure she'll be dead." Realizing the situation would only get worse if she resisted further, she went limp, played it off like she was unconscious, and let them drop her from the bridge. Becky described the sensorial impact of hitting the river. And so, as soon as the sense came to me that I was still alive, I thought my legs were broken. And so I just swam with my hands over to a rock and I climbed up. And as soon as I got there, I heard this car go over the bridge and I saw their headlights go on the beams. Then they were gone. Then after that, I looked around and there was no place I could. It was just a ledge sticking out. So I looked over and I thought I would have to find a place to stay. So I had to get back in the water and swim a ways over to this kind of sandy place. But I crawled up and I found a place that was more like a V. And I went in there just for warmth because my pants had fallen off in the water. So all I had on was a wet sweater and the wind was blowing. So I leaned back against this rock and a rat jumped out. So I picked up a rock. I knew I had to use something for self defense. And then I just covered myself up with rocks and I had my knees up to my chest and I pulled my hair over my knees and that kept me warm. I was just so cold that night. I knew if I fell asleep that I would most likely die. So all night long I kept awake. I don't know exactly what time I was thrown off, about 1 o'clock in the morning, somewhere around there, 12:30. But then I heard all night long. I heard cars coming and going, and I heard a dog bark. I thought maybe I'm by a house. Maybe I should try and climb out. I didn't have any idea what it looked like when I was by or anything, but I was just so bloody. There was blood on my legs. I had scratched all over. And so I waited all night long, and I thought I heard noises like people trying to scare me all night long. I just planned that I would crawl up, and walk on to the highway. Soon dawn came, and I started to get up, and my legs just collapsed. And I thought my legs were broken because I have never had a broken bone in all of my life. And I didn't know what it was like. I just knew I couldn't move my legs. So I cried, and I knew I had to get out of there. So I looked around and it looked like the only way out was behind me because the rest of it was just canyon wall. And this was steep, real steep, but it was more gradual than anything around me. So I climbed backwards with my hands like that scooting, and I would slide back down, and then I would get up again and slide some more, and I cried and cried. And then I finally realized I was hurting really bad by my right side. And I looked down and I had a great big opening in my side. And I started crying worse, worse. Finally, I got to the top. And I had never really carried my plans any further except that I was going to walk to the highway when I got up there. I knew I couldn't walk. I just thought, oh God, what do I do now? And I started crying. I heard a car coming, and I just prayed to God it wasn't a white car, and it wasn't. Those men. And it was a green car, and I just waved my hand. and they stopped immediately. They said, "My God, what happened to you?" I said I was raped and thrown off the bridge, and my little sister too. They said, "Can you walk?" And I said, "No, no." So they carried me into the car, and the man put his jacket around me because I was naked except for the sweater. The assistant prosecutor said, "When you were at the bottom of the canyon, did you have any idea where Amy might be?" As far as I could figure, she was down there too. I just called out her name and I looked for her, but it was dark. And in the morning, I looked for her, but I had in my mind all night that she was dead. And I just think that if I would have found her, I would have died too. The prosecution introduced the following items as physical evidence: Becky's panties, Becky's sweater with a tear in it, Kennedy's knife, crime scene photos of the bridge and canyon wall, Amy's corpse when it was spread out on the shore of the river. One juror was so disturbed by the photo of Amy, she had to turn away. Ron Kennedy's lawyer asked for an early recess because Kennedy was experiencing problems with his rectum and needed to see his doctor. There was some kind of bloody discharge secreting from his anus. When it came time for him to be assigned to a cell in prison, Bubba was likely to be thrilled to see that nature provided him with lube. The taxpayer was footing the bill for his health care. Meanwhile, Becky's family had to pay out of pocket for all the treatments she underwent in hospital. Becky was cross examined by the defense, and Jenkins and Kennedy must have been disappointed by their performances. Kennedy's lawyer just asked her to verify that Kennedy came across as mentally ill and a monster. Jenkins' lawyer tried the tack of suggesting that Jenkins was the leader of the two and could get Kennedy to do whatever he wanted, which clearly wasn't the case. People who were instrumental in Becky's rescue and treatment were cross examined, like Dorothy Strasser, Becky's doctor at the hospital, the diver, and police officers who worked on the case. Dr. James Thorpen performed the autopsy on Amy's body. His findings: she was very cold. She was in full rigor mortis. Her chest cavity was filled with dark red and clotted blood. Her aorta had just about exploded. Her throat was clogged with a bloody froth. Her lungs were punctured by shards of 4 of her ribs. There were no signs of rape. The official cause of death was that her spine was driven 2 inches into her brain, attributing this to the impact it made when she hit the rocks. He identified this as a ring fracture, which occurs when the spinal column bursts through the ring at the base of the skull. April 30th, 1974. Ronald Kennedy and Jerry Jenkins were found guilty on all counts, those being the assault and battery on Becky Thompson, the sexual assault of Becky Thompson, the murder of Amy Burridge. May 1st, 1974. Ronald Kennedy and Jerry Jenkins were sentenced to death. January 27th, 1977. The death penalty was reversed for both men. They were to be resentenced. They were sentenced to life in prison without parole. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.